So now we are going to be receiving those position statements from the political parties. But before that happens, I would like to invite Mr. Vusi Kumbi to come and give us the contextual framework of how we've divided how this proceeding is going to take place. Because after this one, as you can see on the program, we are going to have the ATM, Rise Mzansi, BOSA, and Action SA. So Mr. Vusi Kumbi is going to just give us the contextual framework of how is this divided. And yeah, thank you. Over to you, Vusi.
Good morning, colleagues. Mine is just to provide the context for the setup. So for today, you're going to receive the position statements of the political parties. So they are divided into two. We're firstly going to have those who are currently represented in Parliament, the four biggest one, and just as a disclaimer, we did invite others, but to no avail, just as a disclaimer. And then so they are going to come based on the number of seats they have in the National Assembly. So it's going to be the ANC represented by Mr. Zuko Kodlimbi, followed by the Democratic Alliance as the official opposition, not only in Gauteng but National Assembly. Then it's going to be Dr. Chi Momola from the EFF, and lastly Mr. Narend Singh, the Member of Parliament for IFP. So if you go to the program for day 2, we have panel of experts 1 and 2, right? So the panel of experts, which is Mr. Ashraf Patel, Tandolwetu Lukuko, and Nerissa Mutayan, will be respondents and discussants to this discussion. And then in the afternoon, we're going to have position of statements from political parties that are not in Parliament, with the exception of the ATM, right? So we had to push the ATM to the second because we just wanted to have a balance of the participants. So that will be in the afternoon. So it's going to be ATM, Rise Mzansi, Build One SA, and Action SA. And on tomorrow, the people who are going to be respondents are the second panel, which is Ms. Hauhelom Kumbeni, Dr. Stephanie Bochat, and Mr. Simon Vilagazi. So I'm just saying so that, our panel of experts know where they'll be responding to tomorrow. And then I'll bring back our program director to come and facilitate the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Vusi, for that context. I believe it was clear, but of course, if there was any misunderstanding, he's just seated back there to provide clarity to any of the questions that may arise from that. Okay, we are going to begin now, and I would like to invite the gentleman to my immediate right, who is Mr. Zuko Godlimpi, who is the National Executive Committee member of the African National Congress. Please, yes.
Thank you very much, Program Director. As announced, my name is Zuko Godlimpi. I'm from a small town called Bizana in the Eastern Cape, on the northeastern border of the Eastern Cape in KwaZulu-Natal. I am here on behalf of the African National Congress. My thinking about how to approach today's conversation changed when I was sitting down there, partly because my father here, the ambassador, has already spoken. So I have to adjust my thoughts so that I don't contradict anything that he said. It would be very terrible of me to say anything that he doesn't approve. But here is how I want us to think about this problem. The questions of security, equity, and sustainability in energy and resource extraction and environmental protection have a number of dimensions to them. And in order to underscore all of them, I want us to think about what I call the political economy of resource extraction. The second one will be then the renewable energy debate and the so-called just energy transition, and what the ANC thinks should be South Africa's position on that front. The first issue that I want to raise is that in the political economy of resource extraction is the question of technologies and technological development. And the fact that each energy transition coincides one way or the other with a particular industrial revolution, which is essentially about the development of technologies that humanity uses to improve its material welfare. And because one of the major fossil fuels under scrutiny in this conversation is coal, it is almost important to then foreground the discussion in the history of coal as the primary energy source for the world. Coal emerged to what it is today in the 1800s with the rise of the steam engine. And the steam engine is essentially what you can call the principal driving force of the first industrial revolution, so to speak. So because of the development of the steam engine, there was a need to build an energy technology that can power it up, which is cheap, which is abundant, and which could be exploited over a long time. And that development did not occur in Africa, but that development occurred in Europe. And that is one of the underlying questions in political economy to make us understand why does Europe consume so much of global energy when it doesn't have as much of the proportion of the global population. And what does that have to do with us sitting here in Africa? The point is, the bulk of the coal that has been mined throughout the world, and virtually any other resource that you can think about, has been mined for purposes of the development of Europe. And the development of energy consumption patterns in Africa, and South Africa especially, has only been contingent on the degree of need to build the industrial capacity to extract as much resources as possible in the continent. And in that political economy of development in South Africa for resource extraction has been the birth of a number of small towns whose principal economic driver is resource extraction. So if you go to Mpumalanga, a variety of towns in Mpumalanga are built around the extraction of coal. So the development of South Africa, including its patterns of internal labor migration, have been centered around the dynamic of resource extraction. So the first point about security, equity, and sustainability is not so much about the environment, but about the security of economic means of survival, the equity of any transition that abandons a particular extraction that creates local economies and what that means for the future, and therefore the sustainability of the economic means of survival of the population. That's the one dimension. The second element that I want us to think about is the debate about the concentration of capital for financing the just energy transition has its own particular historical framing that we've got to also account for. And it has to do with the structure of global capitalism, which is a product of this manner of energy consumption that I was talking about. The emergence of the global north as the principal economic power in the world is related, as I was saying, to the steam engine of the 1800s and the rise of the first industrial revolution, and therefore the concentration of capital in those centers of the world. So when we think about the flow of global capital to finance the just energy transition, maybe on a different day, we have to think about the dynamics of capitalist accumulation, capitalist concentration, and capitalist, and the distribution of climate responsibility in that framework. So the second dimension that I must talk about is the ecological degradation problem, which necessitates the conversation about the just energy transition. One of the major problems that the world is contending with now is a crisis of resource extraction that has climate degradation implications. If you go around Johannesburg here, you go towards Soweto, you go across the Gauteng province, the degree of ecological damage that has been visited on this part of the world over the last 200 years is terrible. But again, the problem is that those who are responsible for that degradation are not taking responsibility for the rehabilitation of the ecology. That's one. If you go to parts of the world, you will confront problems of deforestation in the Amazon in Brazil, the same in Asia, and all of it is related again to this irresponsible form of resource extraction that has been plaguing the world. The contamination of water sources through acid drainage problems is a fact that is known by all of us here in Gauteng. I'm sure even the MPL here knows this fact here in Gauteng. I'm making this point to underscore that all of us accept, and at least the ANC accepts, that something dramatic has got to be done in order to reverse the pace of climate damage that is underway globally. And that central to that would have to be some degree of transitioning away from the manner in which we're exploiting fossil fuels to produce energy. So the discussion is not whether or not there should be a transitioning or not a transitioning. But the discussion is about who must transition at what pace as compared to who, and what is the underlying reason for that. Now in February, Germany announced that they are going to spend 16 billion euros for building 4 major natural gas plants to provide energy security. And they say in order to do what? In order to ensure energy security in times where there is little sun and when there is little wind. So part of the discussion in Europe about ramping up investment in renewable energy and renewable technology is also being matched now by an increase in particular forms of fossil fuel investment at the same time. That's one. 2, China and India have the biggest proportion of the world's population, and they happen to have the largest concentration of coal-fired power stations as well. China is in the 1,200 and something range, India is around 200 and something. And at COP26, they refused to commit to a deal that says they must transition at a faster rate such that by 2040, their reliance on coal must be much lesser than where they are. They flat out refused. Why? Because they refuse to be frog-marched into an energy transition pace that undermines their energy transition capacity and energy security in the immediate, and their ability to build the renewable technology capabilities required for them to rely on renewable energy in the long term. Again, they are not saying they are not going to do it, but they are saying not at the pace that you are proposing for us to do. Because there is a lot of internal readjustment that has got to be factored into the equation for it to be sustainable, not just on climate grounds, but also economically and the social organization of how their industry functions. Now, it's true that we are part of the Paris Agreement, which talks about defossilization and this, that, and the other. Matter of factly, the position of the ANC, right? I'm not talking on behalf of government, MP Singh. So don't say government that and so on. Speak on behalf of Luthuli House, and we disagree with that position. We disagree with South Africa's commitments. Not the principle of the commitment, but the pace attached to it. We flat out disagree with that, and we insist that there must be a renegotiation. But in any case, The European Union is also undergoing its own internal dynamics that are forcing them to reconsider the renegotiation of the Paris Agreement. The Russia-Ukraine war has shown all of them that what they thought was a secure energy framework is unstable. And part of the reason why Germany is now improving their investment in gas power stations is precisely because of the disruptions that arose when someone bombed the Nostradam stream. We can debate who did the bombing, but someone did tell us that the US is now a net exporter of gas to Europe just after that bombing happened. So we can have a discussion about who actually did the bombing there, but that's for a different day. 2 minutes, okay. I knew that because of the time constraints, it's going to be a bit tricky. But here is what the ANC's position on the matter summarily is. I don't know how many of us have read the Integrated Resource Plan of 2023. That's our position. That's the broad outline of it. And I want to explain on purpose why I say that's our position as canvassed. But what we at Luthuli House are saying to them now in government when they put it out is that this is not a viable ANC position over the long term. It's very limited. The conception of what energy is and energy security is very limited in the IRP 2023. Now, I'm not going to disown the IRP 2023 entirely. That's the point that I'm making. It's my position that I must hold, but also say it needs to be further developed because it is very limited in how it articulates the problem of energy security. A replacement of coal in the medium to long term has got to be a replacement directly with another energy source that will be abundant, that will be cheap, that will be viable over the long term and sustainable. And the science of energy now tells us that your best bet in that regard is nuclear. So we are going to have to ramp up our nuclear capability over time as we are ramping down our coal dependence. I'm saying coal as a basis of energy in the electricity sense, but not in the petrochemical sense that we're talking about. South Africa is one of the countries with the most developed technological capacity of coal to liquid transformation. That one we will sustain it. We will not abandon our coal, but we are going to have to do something to use coal as an energy source, even if it is not the biggest energy source in electricity over the long term. But on petrochemicals, it's still going to be one of our most sustainable ones. Now, that is important because the closing down of coal towns is a disaster that South Africa cannot afford. The amount of retrenchments that are playing out in the province of Mpumalanga especially is a disaster that we cannot afford. We are facing a similar problem with the collapse of the steel industry in the Vaal. The Vaal is turning into a ghetto by the day precisely because of the collapse of the steel industry. The ANC is not going to build more ghettos in the name of the just energy transition. We will pursue the just energy transition in a manner that is equitable, sustainable, and that guarantees energy security. Just a parting shot on the equitability thing. If we argue that Europe and the US are responsible for the biggest chunk of climate destruction over the past 300 years, surely they have to carry the largest responsibility for climate rehabilitation, and that includes the largest responsibility to transition faster to clean energy sources. But if Germany is now building more fossil fuel capacity as opposed to what they are saying, it tells us that as we have this discussion, we've got to separate carefully between the rhetoric of states and the practice of states. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Golimbi, for the African National Congress's position statement on these issues. So before you begin, I failed to mention something very important, and you benefited from my oversight. So everyone has 15 minutes to speak. 15 minutes. Apologies for that oversight, and the gentleman benefited here from that. So 15 minutes to speak. Yeah, please try to keep your remarks within those confines. And then, of course, if there's something that is being left out, we do have the Q&A in the end. So you'll have a chance when we get to that point to then ventilate some of the important things that may have been left out on your main address. So now, maybe before I invite Mr. Solomon Simangi to give their DA's position, I would like to indicate that everyone will have a chance to engage these positions. It's not just those who are on the program having been tasked to do so tomorrow. Everyone will have a chance, an equal chance to then engage the policy positions that are indicated by political parties here today. Thank you so much. As I invite Mr. Solomon Simangi to give us the position statement of the DA. 15 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Program Director. I don't think that I will be 15 minutes because, funny enough, to some great degree, some of the points that had been put by the ANC, for the first time, I do agree with. To some degree. And I'll tell you what we agree. Look, the issue of climate change is something that is real. And I don't think that there can be any political party that will walk in here and say that they don't agree. And we cannot disagree with the history that has unfolded here, so which has brought us where we are. But here's where we start to then differ. If you start asking what have you done in the last 30 years and what is then the plan going forward, you start then finding that they're very much found wanting. You look at where we are in terms of ensuring that you are able to then repurpose, if you like, the economy and the sectors that are there. How do you then rebuild the sectors that we do have? We are now being told, yes, move to renewables. But what is, failing to be addressed is the issue of how do you then ensure that you have the skills in the country to be able to then carry that. So as an example, the mineral sector in South Africa, the mining sector is carrying 477,000 jobs. And most of them being in the coal and what we call the platinum group of minerals, which will include platinum, palladium, and rhodium. But what we're not talking to is then how do we then, once we start talking about scaling down, what is it that we're introducing? What are we doing with the skills in the skill force that is there, or the labor force that is there, which is something that we now need to be talking to. If you start asking the question, what has been done to then start introducing the new, economic sectors, and what are we doing to then build those sectors? You found that the governing party is found very much wanting, because if they were not, we would be talking about what educational curriculum are we introducing to be starting to talk about these things that we want to then introduce. We are now importing the photovoltaic elements that we're talking about when we're talking about solar panels. We want every house to have a solar panel as part of what we would have had. But the question is, where is the technology coming from? We're not doing that, which means that we're going back to square one, that we are now saying, let's get rid of a resource that we have. But in terms of us getting ready to then build an alternative here, we are also saying, let's import this new technology, or let's not even skill people. We will then, we'll import all this technology, which is not going to help, because when you're dealing with the issues of the impact, you also now need to then say, not impact in terms of only the environment, but impact in terms of also the economy. What does it mean for the people? My learned friend is talking about, how some of these towns are now turned into ghost towns, and I agree. The question is, what are we doing? And this is something that government needs to put in place, and this is what the DA is talking to then say, you now need to have a position to then say, how do you then begin to reskill the labor force that you have to be able to talk to the kind of future that you want to talk to. Yes, we might talk about the slowing of the pace in terms of how we introduce, the transformation that we want to talk to. But part of introducing that is then introducing an element of teaching from a young age that which you want to then see happening. China is not becoming the fastest producers of technology by mistake right now. It did that by introducing an element at a schooling level of teaching technology from a young age so that they are able to then be the global leaders in that. That's what we needed to do. We were the biggest, and we still are the biggest, mineral holders. Right now, if you South Africa has got about $2.5 trillion of minerals. So that is something that we still need to take into consideration and say, as much as you want to then begin to then scale down in terms of the usage of fossil fuels, and you want to then introduce the alternative, are you building the capacity and the capability on the other end to be able to then take care of that? Is your infrastructure also able to then start supporting that? We're now sitting with a problem where we cannot even export even the same minerals at the rate that we now need to be exporting them. You are now sitting at 17% reduction in the last 3 years in terms of your capability to be able to then take some of this mineral out, which has an impact on the economy. The fact that you have rail that is being destroyed, the fact that you have our ports that have been destroyed, the fact that you're not able to then bring an alternative to you being able to then get all these things, and build beneficiation in the country itself, that becomes a big problem that we need to address. So from a DA perspective, we have been saying, instead of talking about the problems that we've been sitting with, and by the way, the other problem that we're sitting with is that the ANC that had, sorry, I don't want to make this into a debate, but the fact of the matter is you've had a situation where the ANC has rules and have laws that govern what should happen in terms of the mines after the usage. So the law is very clear. After the usage, the companies should be responsible for the rehabilitation. So you can't then come and say, this has been a problem that has been happening for 300 years and therefore throw your hands in the air. You now need to then say, what have we done to hold these companies to then account for what they need to do? So from a DA perspective, we're saying, let's start by holding the companies, to account. The second part is to then saying, once you start doing the rehabilitation, reskill those that you want to then help you in building the new economies and to build a new sustainable sectors that we're talking to. But thirdly, we are also saying that let's ensure that we are staying ahead of time by ensuring that the policies that we develop are not reacting to what the rest of the world is doing, but we are beginning to then say, how do you beneficiate right here? How do you then ensure that what you're getting out of the ground is benefiting the people that are on the ground? That talks to also how do you then talk to the issues of curriculum and the teaching that is taking place. You're able to then do that. You have won half the battle before we even talk about the environmental impact. We can talk about those, but the moment you start addressing the issue of you start addressing the issue of the economy, you start addressing the issue of where history has left people, you are then beginning to then address the problem. Right now, the apartheid government had been designed to then impact the poor people the most in terms of where waste will be, like waste from mines. I mean, you go and look at the dumps. The dumps are always next to the townships somewhere. We haven't really brought in technology or even taught people of how to then deal with it. We haven't held the companies that were responsible for that to account for what they have done there. And yet we're talking about then addressing some of these challenges. And this is something that from our perspective, we are saying, let's go back. Let's look at what we needed to have done. Let's look at what the curriculum is doing and can be doing then going forward. But more importantly, let's make sure that when we are demanding something or we are planning to do something, we are able to not be reactive, but be proactive in terms of what we do. So what we're proposing is change in the curriculum, to ensure that we're able to then start planning ahead. The second thing is you now need to then be able to then hold those that are responsible for the damage to account for, what they're supposed to have done in using existing laws that are there. The third thing that you also now need to then do is to make sure that you are able to then repurpose the skill force that is already there that takes care of, the economic factors that we now need to be addressing. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Mr. Msimang. You saved us a lot of time. Thank you so much for that. I would like to invite now Dr. Gumani Chimomola from the Economic Freedom Fighters. Thank you. 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Program Director. And thank you very much, everyone. My name is Gumani Chimomola. I'm Head of Research in the EFF. And thank you for the invitation to the host. I was sitting there listening to the Executive Director, Dr. Kabembe, and the Ambassador. I took a decision to also take a detour. But I can't change what I'm going to say, Ambassador, because I was given a manifesto, a copy of the manifesto to bring here, so that I don't get excited, They say to be young is to be foolish. Now, I've been in Parliament for the last 9 years, and I'm happy that you save time because he says half of what you were going to say, and then you just come and say the difference. That's the beautiful thing about the situation we have between the ruling party and the opposition party. So that's one of the things that's going to change with these coming elections. So we don't want a ruling party that is followed by the opposition, and half the time they are agreeing when things are not working. So the discussion that we're having now, it's framed as a policy dialogue, and this is the detour, Ambassador. I want to applaud you on being frank about the historical context as to why we're here. But at the same time, I want to request you to go and look at a play that was done at the State Theatre titled The Pitfalls of the Nationalist Party, or nationalism, if you put it that way. And the argument that was being made, there's quite a simple argument, is that if you look at the entire continent, particularly from the 1960s, when most countries gained independence, what nationalism did to the continent was to adopt a theoretical, scientific approach to how they want to arrange society. And the consequence of that is the idea was to make Africa to look like Europe. I want to encourage you to go and watch that play and watch a lecture by Professor Lwazi Lushaba. He's a lecturer at the University of Cape Town. He's in the US now. He's teaching a particularly interesting area about slavery. And he makes an argument that, and you'll see how this fits into the discussion we're having about energy. He makes an argument that when you talk slavery in today's terms, particularly in academia, the immediate reference is the transatlantic movement. But we had the biggest slavery arrangement in the Western Cape. Those people who were slaves in the Western Cape never crossed the Atlantic or the Mediterranean. The Africans, both in neighboring territories that are now defined by the 1948 arrangement, before 1948 in the 1800s, when they demarcated the borders. So I want us to have that perspective in mind. And if we can all watch that play and watch the lecture by Lushaba, you will get an appreciation that two things happened in South Africa, very unfortunate, in the post-1994 arrangement. And it shaped what we consider as policy dialogue. And I'm taking all this time to take this history because the EFF manifesto is quite simple. I'll do it in 2 minutes once I'm done with these points. So what we consider as policy dialogue today, it's influenced by that historical perspective. That we have never had an opportunity to ask ourselves some of the difficult questions of how is it that we want to reimagine our relations as human beings with both natural resources, be it under the soil, water, what we consume as energy. So we're still trying to chase this image of what society should look like, importing it from the north to the south. And I heard the ambassador saying that there is a deliberate rise of the south. And I agree with him, partly, Ambassador, I do. Although we can debate the shortfalls and the shortcomings, which are very obvious. I don't think it will be a big debate. I think we'll just agree that maybe we need to rework it. So the two things that happen which are very unfortunate, one of them is that what is considered a policy dialogue in South Africa is really not a policy dialogue. What you have is that you have a group of people who think the same mostly, get funded by the same people, tell you what they think, sometimes tell you what they think because of what their funders tell them. Because you write a proposal, you said, we are going to host a seminar on climate change and development, and this is what we're trying to achieve. And you try and match it to what their objectives are as funders. I used to do research at Public Research Institute about 10 years ago. And I did some of the proposals. So I have seen that experience, And you end up not having an open dialogue. You end up having a top-down approach to how you want to transmit ideas and values and relations. So you look the same, you speak the same, you invite the same people. Sometimes we get shocked when we're invited to these platforms, So the outcome of that is, even when we talk about the Paris Agreement, you have a situation where, you sit in France, you agree on the framework of how we move. We call it just transition, just for who? It's a question. And then it becomes a commitment of government. And I don't want to blame the ruling party, because I've come to appreciate the pitfalls of nationalism. I sometimes I actually feel sorry that you are stuck with 11.2 million people who are unemployed looking for jobs every day, but they can't find it. You are told by the World Bank that if you use the upper measure bound of poverty, 62% of your population is actually poor. If you have 62 million people and you say 32%, it's poor. That's almost half of people who are poor. And poverty in its truest sense, because if you go to Oliven, Diepsloot, Alexander, Nyanga, you get to see what is poverty, So we have not had an opportunity to actually talk about frank framing of how is it that we want to relate with our resources as Africa. That's the first thing that happened. Very unfortunate. If you get funded by, and it's not conspiracy, if you get funded by Open Foundation, you do a proposal, you tell them what you want to do, it must look like what they want, The second thing that happened is that, and maybe before I go to the second thing, 7 minutes, we had the Electoral Amendment Bill in Parliament, and I'm using it as an example. We had an electoral bill, Mr. Singh will know, we received communication from a set of organizations. It's a grouping. They said, don't sign this. If you support this, we will tell the people that you are a threat to our democracy. That was civil society engaging in South Africa. I just use it as an example before I proceed. Now, this is what must contextualize an honest, frank policy dialogue, right? And this is the second part. You have about 53 billion tons of coal. So now, you have to link what is being talked about as energy security. It's actually national economic security, and energy become part of it. So it's not a standalone security item. Your defense capabilities are part of your national economic security. You can't separate them from economic security. So fundamentally, you organize society around economic security. So ESCOM tell us that, look, we can use coal for the next 200 years. At the rate at which we're using it now, we have not built any power station. Okay, we built 2, but we have not built any additional generation capacity beside Medupe and Kusile. So it means that outside the European framing of policy dialogue, we have to then look at that natural endowment and then agree as to what will be the most practical way forward. Bearing in mind, number one, the number of unemployed people, the number of ghost towns is talking about. If you have been to Namibia, it's actually shocking. People actually pack up and leave. And you drive past through a town that has no life. Almost like a designed afterthought to say that we'll leave it here and we'll say people used to live here, and it never happened, but it has happened. Some parts of the Northern Cape have a similar problem, So you need to look at that level of reserves at a coal level and says, how do we generate maximally energy from it? And this is where the EFF policy position becomes very easy. So when you read our funding manifesto, but mostly the election manifesto, it's not a product of a boardroom arrangement where Gumani, as the head of research, proposed a draft. No. We have had about 19 policy dialogue, the way you refer to them. We call them consultative meetings with stakeholders, domestic workers, security guards, energy experts in some instances. We engage them. And they say to us, look, this is what you can do. We take it, we look at our funding manifesto or reference, and then we draft what we now consider partly a consultative product, but a policy position which is a guide on how we're going to govern going forward. It's very practical. It has timeline, dates, and whatnot. So we say to achieve energy security as part of national economic security, we have to use the coal maximally. We have to build additional generation capacity. Relying on the coal, that's what we say. We can have a balanced approach where we put in nuclear. We've been advocating for nuclear, and the part of our advocating for nuclear, we say you need to find a sensible financing model. And not talking about borrowings from the market, we're talking about there are other models where you can build, operate, and transfer later. We're trying to engage that discourse so that we are not limited to having to go to the markets, which are in 3 places in the world. Once you pass London, New York, and then you go to the east, you will find that you are very limited. But China can give you an option of build, operate, and transfer. They have capacity. Russia can also do it. France can do it. So that I don't come across as if I'm advocating for a specific block, right? So how do you then link this maximum use of coal with the rest of the extractive industry? The good thing that the ANC has done, and they've done very well, is to say that minerals as they are currently are in the custodianship of the state. So anyone who's mining, they are mining things that are actually national resources. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. What we need to do is to perhaps have a different conversation. Not a cosmetic one, but what is it that we are talking about when we are referring to beneficiation? Because once you resolve the issue of energy security as part of national economic security, we then now can talk about how do you maximally beneficiate those things. So I did a tweet recently where I went to an old records and pull out how many people used to be employed by state-owned companies. ISCO used to be the biggest employer. Today, outside the state, Shoprite is the biggest employer, followed by Bidvest. Shoprite is about 150,000 people, Bidvest 132, followed by Pick n Pay at 90,000. ISCO used to employ more than 400,000 people. If you consolidate all these subsidiaries, including their main company, So you are able to have a far much frank and honest conversation if the minerals that are going to be beneficiated are being beneficiated with sound and reasonable energy security plan, part of the national economic security. So these are minerals that belongs to the people, all of them. So part of the frank conversation we'll have in future as policy dialogue is to then how do we honestly say, well, Anglo, BHP, Billiton, Exaro, Sereti, you have done well so far. We see the damage you have left behind. When you leave mines, you don't close them properly. Thank you. Can we have a different model of beneficiating these minerals? Beneficiation partly has to be public-owned beneficiation with clear job targets. So in this sector, these are the kind of jobs we want. We're not going to leave it to the private sector. We're going to do it ourselves. All these will be able to lay out a plan that can considerably outline our relationship with our climate. Until we resolve that and we're driven by capitalism, markets, we'll not be able to have an honest conversation about how do we deal with climate change. It won't happen. And those two things, national economic security founded on sensible energy plan that maximally use coal, and then we're able to say how we're going to beneficiate our mineral resources, it is only then that South Africa and the rest of the continent can be able to frankly discuss, can we have a common coordinated agenda around beneficiation? From South Africa all the way to Cairo. You can't now. In some instances, there are wars that are being funded by multinational corporations. There are countries where they just build a landing strip there in the mine. Yeah. I have my own clock is telling me I have 10 seconds. So you can't coordinate these things if you don't have good energy security plan. We'll be told to stop using coal one day, and the ANC is not going to save us.
Hey, that was quite a way to end. Thank you so much, Dr. Kumani, for the EFF's position statement. Okay, now we are nearing the end of the session, and we are going to have Mr. Narad Singh, who is the Member of Parliament for the Inkatha Freedom Party, to give us his party's position statement. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Program Director, and I want to greet His Excellency Ambassador Machila, a friend of old, not an old friend, although he's graying and I'm balding. And old would apply to both of us in that respect. I want to greet the facilitators of this program and congratulate you for having brought all of us together. It's very seldom that so many political parties gather and speak about an issue that affects everybody in our country. And so far, I think from what we've heard, there are some differences, but it's not the end of the world for us to find some common position as we move forward, and as Ruth said, for SA Incorporated. And I think that's our major responsibility here, and not to debate with each other and say which policy is the best and which is not. I want to greet my fellow panelists and my political colleagues here and present our position, the IFP's position on the topic. And our brief was to firstly find out whether our manifesto says anything about energy systems, load shedding, etc., etc. And I'm proud to say yes. The first point on our 13-point manifesto speaks to energy, load shedding, and a diversified mixed energy system. And we've got more details in our manifesto that's on our website. The second thing is that when we talk about resource extraction, development, and climate change in South Africa, there's a linkage. And for now, it seems to me that a lot of the debate or discussion has been on resources like coal, oil, and maybe gas. But there are so many other resources that we are taking from our ground here. And I think Ambassador spoke to some of them. Lithium, platinum, sand winning is a resource that we are taking. And you know, we also got to look at the impact of that extraction on socioeconomic development, and then also on climate change and how it impacts on climate change. And my colleague here mentioned the issue of the mines, the mine dumps here. I mean, acid mine drainage is one of the most serious problems that Gauteng is going through. And yet, for the last 20 years or 30 years that I'm in politics now, we've been talking about this at environmental committees. The Auditor General has reported on acid mine drainage and the impacts it has on water systems, etc. But very little has been done to ensure that we mitigate the risks of acid mine drainage. And it starts off mainly from the fact that pre-1994 and even post-1994, the polluter pay principle has not been applied. People came, they extracted whatever and left their mess behind for us to face the consequences. So I think as a policy position, any government needs to ensure that the polluter pay principle is a principle that we must adopt. And anybody who wants to extract resources from the ground must appreciate the impact that it's going to have on local communities and on the environment. So that's just by way of a general comment, but we are delighted to be part of this dialogue, and as we would say, South Africa is endowed with a wealth of natural resources, and it stands at the crossroads of socioeconomic prosperity and environmental sustainability. Despite its resource richness, the current governance struggles to maintain basic services like electricity, a cornerstone for both domestic well-being and economic vitality. This failure not only undermines the potential to harness these resources for national development, but also exacerbates the socioeconomic inequalities that scar the landscape of our nation. So what we say as the IFP, the challenge we face is to navigate a path that fosters socioeconomic growth and equity, all while preserving the environmental integrity crucial for future generations. At the heart of our dilemma is the essential need for energy security, a foundation without which society teeters on the brink of chaos. Yet, the pursuit of this security presents a paradox, as it often clashes with the urgent global climate goals. This dichotomy is particularly pronounced in South Africa and the broader African continent, where development and environmental sustainability must be balanced delicately. Nonetheless, it's crucial to recognize that a sustainable environment is not merely a luxury, but a cornerstone for socioeconomic prosperity now and in the future. Globally, we are told, the scale of the challenge becomes even more apparent. Recent estimates by the International Monetary Fund suggest that eliminating coal from the global energy mix would cost around $78 trillion. With the current global expenditure on new generation capacity at almost $350 billion annually, it would take approximately 220 years to complete this transition. Similar challenges apply to the oil sector, which holds a comparable share in the global energy market. And this was highlighted recently in the New York Times in an article of the 14th of March, which pointed out that the surge in power use is threatening US climate goals. This evidence underscores that the crisis we face is not isolated to us in the African continent, but a global phenomenon affecting countries at all stages of development. In this complex scenario, a balanced transition emerges as the only visible path forward. The IFP, through the vision of our late founder and our contributions in Parliament and when I was MEC for Environment in 1997 and further on, we have consistently advocated for prudent resource extraction and environmental stewardship. Our guiding principle is anchored in Section 24 of our Constitution, which champions the right or entrenches the right to a healthy and sustainable environment for both present and future generations. This principle underscores the significance we place on environmental protection and conservation, not only for us, but for the future. In alignment with our vision, several critical considerations must be prioritized in South Africa's approach to resource extractions. Firstly, we believe sustainable development. Advocacy for sustainable extraction methods is crucial to minimize environmental degradation. And somebody else spoke about advocacy. I think it was, I wanted to say comrade Solly, but I know they don't like the word comrade. So we'll just say, we'll say the honorable. This includes promoting technologies and practices that mitigate soil, water, and air pollution, adhering to the precautionary principle and the duty of care. Secondly, community engagement and fair compensation. It is essential that communities affected by resource extraction are part of the planning process, receive fair compensation, and benefit from economic activities such as job creation and infrastructure development. Legislators such as us have a duty to ensure these standards are met. Turning to economic diversification. Reducing dependence on single resources and fostering a resilient economy is vital for long-term economic stability, ensuring the nation can weather global market fluctuations. With regard to regulation and enforcement, we need to have clear and unambiguous legislation and regulations which must govern resource extraction, ensuring adherence to environmental safety and standards. And we are falling far short in that aspect. We've got good legislation, but when it comes to enforcement, I think we fall very short of ensuring enforcement with all these companies, whether they're state-owned companies, mining companies, whatever, including the sand-winning people. And sand-winning is a resource extraction. And you hear of people drowning, children drowning, because there aren't enough danger mitigation around those areas. So kids go and swim, they drown, they die. So we need regular inspections and stringent penalties for violations, embodying the principle, and as I said earlier on, that polluters must remediate any environmental damage, which is the polluter pay principle. The fifth thing is investment in research and development. We need to support the development of new, less harmful extraction technologies and safer working conditions if we need to progress. Skills transfer is a top priority in this respect. Renewable energy transition. The political support for transitioning away from fossil fuels as much as is reasonably possible towards renewable energy sources is crucial for reducing the country's carbon footprint and mitigating climate change impacts. Talking about carbon footprints, this whole business of carbon credits, which has been approved at international level, is something that we don't believe in. Because what's happening now, countries that are polluting, especially the Western countries, are using countries in Africa and poor parts of America to go and plant trees and do all sorts of things, and you trade carbon credits as bonds. And then I was, well, I won't say pleasantly surprised. I saw yesterday that a certain political party that has come onto the scene, talking to the leader who's unwell, and I won't mention who that leader is currently, talking about encouraging Russians and others to come here and plant trees so that they can get carbon credits for the pollution they cause, in their countries, and use us here in our country for that to happen. Now, we really got to look at that. And then CBAM comes into picture, the Carbon Budget Adjustment Mechanism, which impacts on all of us. It's a good thing. It's a carrot and stick approach. But at the end of the day, the developed countries need to know what impact CBAM will have on us in the immediate future. Resource revenue transparency. We need to ensure transparent management of revenues from resource extraction, which is essential for public trust and accountability, with funds allocated to critical public services like infrastructure, education, and healthcare. And we know what's happening in certain parts of our country, platinum, etc., who is benefiting. A certain group of people benefit from the extraction. The communities don't benefit from what they should be benefiting from. Environmental conservation, designating and enforcing protected zones for areas of significant ecological importance helps preserve biodiversity and natural habitats. We at the moment at the IFP, we are pursuing the protection of the Great African Sea Forest, which is 100 kilometers along our coastline. So we are involved in that project. Lastly, international cooperation. Engaging in international agreements and collaborations can bolster global efforts towards good, sustainable resource management and environmental conservation. I'm saying can, but we must look at the agendas of some of these countries that want to offer us money. At the moment, there's about 8 billion rand or dollars or so that's been committed to South Africa. We haven't used a cent towards the just transition program that we have. And why haven't we? We don't have a plan. So we need to sit down and say, what is this plan? We are getting money. Let's utilize that money to the best of our ability. I don't know how much time I got. In conclusion, South Africa's, in Parliament we have a clock, we can see it. My fighter here had his clock in front of him. In conclusion, South Africa's rich and endowment of natural resources presents an opportunity for growth and development. However, realizing this potential requires an approach that equally prioritizes socioeconomic development, environmental sustainability, and equitable resource distribution. The IFP remains committed to advocating for policies and practices that uphold these principles, ensuring a prosperous and sustainable future for all South Africans. I must once again pause and note the emphasis on the importance of environmental protection and conservation. This emphasis is not only for our sustainable use of resources, health, and socioeconomic well-being, but also, as I said, for future generations. So I hope that our position resonates with some of you, and we will be very interested to know from the academics that are here and even from business how one can improve it, so that collectively as political parties, when we get to Parliament, I know we are getting to Parliament soon, all of us who are here will be back in Parliament in some way or the other, and we need to influence the kind of change for the future generation. So thank you very, very much for this opportunity, and God bless. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Singh, for the IFP's position statement. So now that was the last position statement for this session, which means we're going to be moving on to the questions and answer session. But before we do that, I'll just to inform everyone that we have a team that is taking pictures and we are posting them on our social media platforms. If there's anyone who objects to being posted, can you please talk to our team there at the back, Ms. Ndawo and then Ms. Magombe Ratito, there at the back. So we are taking pictures of just posting them on our social media platforms. But if you object to that, you can please talk to us. We do have the consent forms that you are going to issue out tomorrow to be signed by everyone. Is that fine and clear? Thank you so much. Sorry? Ratito, you will talk to the team there at the back and then they will give you every information about that. Is that fine? Thank you. Okay, it's time for engagements. We have heard the policy positions and statements from our political parties for this session. Now we're going to just take a break and then do the Q&A for this one, and then we're going to move to the next one after that one. So I'm hoping to take 2 sets of 3 hands, and I hope we keep it as brief as possible, our questions. Just I'm going to limit 1 question per person, please, because now we are running against the clock. We're going to have a mic moving around. Actually, we're going to have 3 of them, I believe, for this side, and there at the back. So these things are going to move a bit faster. Is that clear and fine? Thank you so much. So I'm going to start recognizing hands now, and then we'll have the mic sent to you, okay? I'm going to start there at the back. 1, 2, 3. In that order, please.
Thank you, fellow panelists and colleagues. Name is Mr. Patel, IGD. I think what we've heard from the different parties in this sector is just a smatterings of different elements of energy, economic, extractive policy. What I would have liked to listen from the leading parties is the core policy frameworks that we have. So currently we have the IRP. Yes, there has been a discussion on that. We also have the climate change bill. And that bill has been in Parliament for the last several months, but there's been very little kind of public participation in both. So you have an IRP which is energy driven. You have the climate change bill which is broader. It's about climate resilience and mitigation, etc. You have the Electricity Regulation Act that was passed, very, very controversial, which is going to move towards a kind of privatized energy system that's going to make energy in the long run unaffordable for the vast majority of our people. And then the big elephant in the room, essentially, from a public policy perspective over the last several years, is we have 2 centers of policy making regarding energy in this country. You have the IRP, Department of Minerals or Energy, that's custodian of policy. Then you have the Presidential Climate Change Council, which is like another center of policy making. And you have basically a kind of 2 parallel policy processes running at odds with each other. And within all political parties, or especially within the ruling party, there is this schizophrenic approach to policy making, and that's why we're in an energy crisis at this point in time. And that has not been resolved, and I don't think after the election it will be resolved. So that is the crisis. That is the core problem of the shutdowns or the lockouts or whatever. You have the energy crisis that we face, etc., etc. So I'm just putting this out there. I don't think the leading parties have addressed that, because this is a policy dialogue, and I want to see a critical discourse on these issues. Thank you.
Do we stand? I think decorum.
If you can just introduce yourself, affiliation, and then you go
Okay,
ahead.
okay. Good morning, everyone. Almost said comrades as well. Good morning, everyone. The name is Tando. I will be making a bulk of my input tomorrow, but for now I just have a simple, maybe not easy question. I'd like to frame it in, Climate Action Network South Africa is civil society. So just to get into it quickly, thank you so much, number one, for all of the interventions. I think they were very, very insightful. I, for one, picked up on a thread, and it's a thread that I believe runs across these 4 that have spoken. And I'd like to frame it in this way. Let's frame it in terms of South Africa Inc., right? South Africa Inc., I believe, is largely apolitical. It's an abstract idea that we're all pulling more or less in the same direction for the benefits and for the benefit of South African people generally. Now, the common thread that you guys have all mentioned are the following. Maybe let me pose it this way. How many of us in the room recall a time where you would go for a full day without electricity going away, except for the last 20 some odd days. There was a time from the time you woke up to the time you fell asleep, electricity was available. I think all of us remember that time. And it's fair to say we're all trying to get back to that time and go beyond that, right? So if we're thinking in terms of that South Africa Inc., you guys have identified the fact that in the short term, we've got electricity challenges or energy challenges. We've got economic challenges as a result of the energy constraints that we face, including the rail challenges, right? You've identified that climate change and environmental destruction seems to be a very strong cornerstone of the impacts that we're experiencing today, and that the bulk of that responsibility sits with so-called global north countries. Now, if I may frame my question in this way, we're now going to elections. We're all unsure about what the outcome might be, except for the fact that the four will sit in parliament. So there's a very likelihood that there might be a coalition government. As it stands, gentlemen, there's a thread that you guys all agreed to. What is the likelihood that in that specific thread that you guys all agree on, that we would be able to pull in the same direction and find resolution to the challenges that we're facing related to needing to get our country out of the quagmire that it's in economically, but also to address the developmental challenges that we face as a country in light of climate change and what it's doing to our people and to the environment? It's directed to all four. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those interventions, gentlemen. My name is Kgaurelo Mkhumbeni, and I work at the Institute for Security Studies, which is a policy think tank that is Pan-Africanist, and I work in the Climate Risk and Human Security Project. So my question, I actually have two key questions here. I would have loved to hear a lot more about political will, institutional capacity from your political parties, and as well as commitment in terms of how do you plan to scale up investment for climate change in future for South Africa? Because one, South Africa has a golden opportunity in the next coming years to position itself as a climate champion for Africa and globally as well. Within the UNFCCC process, South Africa has played a big role in shaping how we present ourselves to the world as a continent. So I want to hear your reflections. What is the plan moving forward for positioning South Africa as a global player, as a climate champion? And two, what is the plan in terms of strengthening political will, reflecting on the current positions that we have moving forward? Thank you.
Okay, let's wrap up this set, Ambassador, and then the following one, and then I'll come to you. So, yes, I'll just stick to the program. I'll start with you, Mr. Godlembi, and then, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. This is the problem of time allocations. You try to load as much as you can in that limited time, and you don't satisfy everyone's expectations. Now, Mr. Patel, that's Patel, right? Okay. A disclaimer, firstly, one of the problems I have is that my age mates like Bokumani have the luxury of speaking their minds. I have the constraint, being young as I am, of speaking on behalf of a government that has been in office for 30 years. So I can't disown everything and start reinventing the wheel anew. I have to account for what has happened and then try add. But let's start with the policy schizophrenia. Let me start with that. It's true. It's a problem. The disorganization of the state's policy pipeline is a problem. Now, in our manifesto now, at least which I was central in putting together, we do make the point that we need policy alignment under the purview of a robust industrial policy. And one of the things we specifically say is that we want some of the mandates that are falling through the cracks, DMRE, DTIC, DPE, and so on, we want them to be aligned in order to overcome this problem. And this has been South Africa's macro organization problem since '94. You have a lot of departments that, for quite frankly, shouldn't exist as separate departments, but should be directorates of one big thing. And if you think about the example of the Japanese experience with the MITI, that's what we're trying to build. So we want a big pilot agency, sort of department that does what the National Planning Commission was supposed to have been, but was repurposed to be this useless thing that it is now. That's the sort of thing that we want to re-anchor and bring online. What are we going to do about the electricity? So the Climate Change Bill, the IRP Bill, the Electricity Regulation Act, they are all a reflection of this problem. That one minister and their department sit in their own corner and do their own thing, but if you articulate them as state policy, they don't make sense. The Electricity Regulation Act was brought in as a quasi-war bill, if we must put it like that. It was smuggled through the back door because there was a load shedding crisis. But its implications, the ramifications that it has, they are much larger going forward. And you are correct, it has to do with the pricing problem. So we are trying to deal with that. We'll certainly put up a fight after elections. I can tell you that. You say it won't happen, but it is already happening. If you ask me in the ANC's Economic Transformation Committee, and you ask someone else elsewhere, you will realize that we are broadly agreeing, but we're at war on the detail of what must happen. And I think it ties in with what Kgaugelo was saying about South Africa positioning itself as a climate champion in global dynamics. It's an important thing, Kgaugelo, but it has its own downside. And the downside is what we're talking about South Africa's ability to balance between its development trappings and the need to meet global commitments on the one hand. That we've got to be careful not to be global champions in a manner that shoots us on the foot. We must be global champions for climate change awareness, but the substantive manner in which we move on those areas, we've got to be careful about how we do it. So right now, South Africa is in fact a leading climate champion in Africa. But what we've now gone back to, and this is in conversation with African countries as well, has been the major question that says, to what degree do we balance between the necessary need to transition and Africa's development backlogs so that we move with everybody on board? So we are a champion, but a champion that is now having a nuanced conversation with the world. Then the political will still exist there. If you look at the fact that we signed the Paris Agreement when big global players were refusing to sign it, if you look at the fact that we've been central in COP throughout when big players have been refusing to be a part of, it demonstrates that political will. It has always existed. But that political will is now being called back to sit down and rethink what are the development trappings that you are sitting with and how do you not undermine them. Thando, can political parties agree on energy security and economic this? I think from this conversation you can tell that we agree. Even on areas where we say we disagree, we actually agree on the broad substance of what has got to happen. I think we will agree on that. We will disagree on the technical detail of how to move forward. But at a strategic level, I think there is agreement. I think there will be appetite for that. I don't think there will be coalition government. I think we are going to win elections. So our agreement is not contingent on coalition. It's agreement just in principle that we've got to try to do these things. The one point that I think it was Thando saying SA Inc. is not political. This is my parting shot. You see, Thando, the construction of SA Inc. is very political. It's an abstract concept that is foregrounded on philosophical principles that South Africans can fundamentally disagree on. The question of who belongs in South Africa, what does belonging in South Africa look like, and what are the moral entitlements of each and every South African as part of the construction of South Africa Inc. is a philosophical and ideological battle that we have to keep on getting inside of, including in terms of energy security as well. There are South Africans who are experiencing energy poverty, even when there's no load shedding. And that is part of the problem of South Africa Inc. Load shedding, yes, is a major problem because it disrupts all of us. But even when the lights are on, as we've been having them in the past 30 days, there are South Africans who, as part of South Africa Inc., are battling with energy poverty. And that is part of the construction of South Africa Inc. What does belonging look like when me, I have energy abundance, but my mother at home in the villages is locked in energy poverty. So the hard construction of South Africa Inc. and the policy choices attendant to it is a very political phenomenon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Golimbi. I would like to invite Mr. Msimang.
Well, thank you very much. Maybe let me start off by right at the end and ask Kgaugelo if, the question that Kgaugelo has asked, and ask if is asking if there's political will. Unfortunately, in South Africa, you're dealing with something that I'd like to call the muscling by the majority. And, this is something that usually happens when you take ideas, when you deposit ideas to the legislature, to parliament. The ANC always wants to use its majority. So you can come up with a brilliant plan, but the fact of the matter is, it will not be coming from any of their comrades, so it will not be accepted. So I can tell you from majority of the opposition that there is will to form part of the solution. And I can give you a number of examples when these things would have been done, but are never really taken forward. So yeah, whether this will translate into anything tangible when they lose their majority now and have to then be forced to be working with others, it's something that I think South Africa cannot wait for. You cannot have the tyranny of the majority being the order of the day, going forward. And I think we might as well be able to then get to then answers to that. 30 years into democracy, and you're still saying that people who are energy insecure. The question that you need to be asking, or you need to be answering, is you inherited something that you should have built on, not destroy, that should have actually then ensured that ultimately able to then provide everybody. In fact, you have actually destroyed which was in existence, built something which cost 3 times what it should have costed, and you're still not able to then provide energy to everybody else. That's a quagmire that we now need to then be saying, how do we then answer to that? And issues of corruption and all of that, but that will be a conversation for another day. The thing that we now need to then be saying is, how do we then ensure that people become energy secured while also ensuring that people become economically secured? And this is something that needs maybe to then latch on to what Thando was asking us to then say, how do we get people out of the quagmire? You cannot talk about ensuring people's economic security if you cannot ensure that the infrastructure is there to support them. And that talks to the energy supply, that talks to the availability of transport, that talks to the availability of other social amenities that people do need. And then once you start talking to those things and you build around that, then you can talk about how do we then move forward. Right now, you still have people that have to burn tires, that have to burn paraffin on a daily basis, that have to still burn wood, to be able to then cook. You cannot talk about how do you make people, economically secured if you're not going to be talking about how do you then make them infrastructure secured. So that infrastructure that you need to be talking to needs to be talking to that. But you cannot give people just a cable, a copper cable that is connected into the house if it's not supported by a plant somewhere that is able to then generate the electricity. Somebody was saying that we have more people that used to work for entities like ESCOM. The reverse is also true, that ESCOM used to employ a quarter of what is employed today, but it used to produce double the amount of electricity that we are producing today. So it doesn't necessarily mean that increasing the number of people that are working for the state equates to you having more productivity. That is also another question that we also now need to then be answering, to then say, are we getting the maximum output out of what we are putting in that will ultimately benefit the people at the end of the day, which is now also a problem that South Africa is sitting with. And then I think Mr. Patel is asking an important question about the schizophrenic behavior. When you have an organization that is leading, that wants to hold on to the monopoly on something, and on the other end, realizing that the monopoly is not working, that's how you get then the clash that you're sitting with. On one end, they want to keep this dinosaur called ESCOM in a format that it's in. On the other hand, they're realizing that ESCOM, irrespective of how many billions you pump into it to try and bail it out time and time again, is not actually then able to keep up because of what they have actually agreed to, in terms of the climate, in terms of the commitments that they've made on international platforms. Therefore, you are now forced to then scale down. But you're scaling down without bringing an alternative. And I've said this before. If you scale down without building or bringing an alternative, you are going to struggle. You are seriously going to struggle. What is the alternative? Are we bringing the alternative here? The economy had been built around us being able to generate electricity. That's how towns were built. We were doing from it, there was a value chain from the mining to the production of electricity to the distribution of electricity. That was what was in place. Right now, you don't have that. You've made a commitment. You don't have the resources as an alternative. And now you will find that there is now a clash in terms of where we are, policy-wise. And this is something that has to be, answered to. But lastly, here's the thing. I've said it and I'll repeat it again. Until such time as you have clarity in terms of the policy, in terms of where you want to go, your economic sectors that you want to drive, and how you want to then get there, and ensure that from an early age, you're able to then invest in building that up, you will not be able to then deal with the challenges that we're sitting with. I've said, the ANC have been talking to us about, addressing the legacy of apartheid. We're still having mining dumps that are still sitting there. It is the poor that are still being affected the most about that. We haven't done anything. When it rains, as acid rain, the acid mine water that seems to be bubbling, you go to R21 right now. R21, actually R25, is actually then collapsed at some point. Because of that, we haven't been able to then ensure enough drainage from there. It has affected the economic ability of the particular area. More and more people that used to be working in the area are not also now being able to then work. So I am saying that, in order to be able to then address these challenges, you cannot address them in isolation. You cannot have electricity minister saying one thing, the economic minister sitting somewhere else saying another thing, and your infrastructure a minister sitting somewhere and saying another thing. You need all of them sitting around the room and say, how do we then get the South Africans out of this? And you need all political players to be able to then help you to deal with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Msimang. Dr. Command, please.
I'll be very quick because I think last time I spoke here, it took very long. Ambassador Mashela, I'm going to come back to you. And the reason why I'm coming back to you, maybe it's because of the color of the hair. I'm being appreciative at this moment. One of the things that is, I struggle with it both at a personal level and at deployment level. Mr. Patel stand up and ask all questions related to the ANC, all of them. There's not one point where he says, I looked at your manifesto and I think, yeah, you differ with the ANC, but I don't have the details. So our manifesto is 260 pages. It's an A5 booklet this size. And we've printed some, we've shared online. And the reason why, when I started, I said, I want to encourage you to go and watch. I hope State Theatre has a recording, but if they don't have it, I'll make it available to you. And anyone who wants to see it, I'll share the copy of that play and the lecture by Dr. Lushawa. How you organize society and understand it is not coincidental, it's scientific. For you to be able to stand up and say, part of what's not working is because how we want to understand our relationship with everything else, including ourselves. There was a point in time where there was importation of ideas. And we have to break that relation and start thinking differently about what would, I don't want to use the word Pan-African, because it's complicated in that people start organization, and with all due respect, call them Pan-African. And at the essence of those organizations, you can relate with each other beyond boundaries, So we have to find a way of saying, whether we're talking about energy security, education, democratic practices, early childhood development, is the framework we're using to, one, understand each other, but to think about going forward. Is that framework correct? You risk sounding like you are off topic when you engage at the platforms. Because the question you're asking is entirely reworking the framework of what is being discussed. Almost like you're being radical. Everyone is going there. You said, okay, I hear you. You're all going there. I will come with you. But is the framework which led us to saying we're going there correct? Not how we get there. I mean, they are going to privatize ESCOM. They are already privatizing ESCOM now. I can't stand here and want to debate why we should not privatize ESCOM. They're doing it. ESCOM is in 4 companies now. 3 independent, 1 holding company. The logic there is difficult to comprehend. I can't stand here and discuss with you why there's Minister of Electricity and Minister of Energy. I'm too young for that. I can't. Fundamentally, the issue is the framework which you are using to ask me a question. Is it a correct framework? And I say it's not. That's what I said at the beginning. And I don't blame the ANC anymore, because I have now become to appreciate that the importation of how we frame discussion, discourse, and engagement was wrong from the beginning. So they were bound to fail. The ANC was bound to fail. It's just a matter of when are they going to lose power, but it was bound to happen. And if whoever comes in, whether it's in coalition or not, whether we can find each other, it's neither here nor there. We have to go back to that question. There were Africans who were dealing with this question in the 1960s. They asked serious questions in the 1960s. Some of them died. Some of them were killed, cancer, exile. They were asking fundamentally, is the framework we're using to engage with each other correct? Before we come to talk about energy, is the framework correct? And it's not. So please do read that manifesto, at least election manifesto. Leave the founding manifesto. That one, maybe I'm asking too much. You might just become a member tomorrow. But the election manifesto, if we're going to engage meaningfully with asking each other fundamental questions, I mean, I feel sorry. He can't say much. I'm telling you. By the time you leave here, we would have gotten 3 calls. Minister of Energy, Minister of Electricity, and the Commissioner of the presidential, who's the president himself. So I won't answer the question about coalition. The president of the EFF says that we're willing to go into coalition. We're happy to take the Minister of Finance. And there are clear reasons why we're willing to do that, and he articulates some of it. So if you read my article in the Business Day last week, I touch on it. There's one coming on the Financial Mail this week where I expand on actually why it makes sense. We should go into coalition so that there is some sense of trying to rebuild that consensus that you were talking about, Executive Director, at the beginning. So it's part of what should be the future of South Africa. But once we are there, are we all willing to then engage each other seriously? Rise Mzansi, Action, whether they're in parliament or not, they might not even go to parliament, but we must engage them. Are we thinking about how we want to rebuild this country properly? Then we'll talk about energy later.
Thank you, Dr. Kumani. Mr. Singh, please proceed.
I'll be very brief. Don't wish anything on the other parties, Faisal. We don't know if we'll get back to parliament, but I am sure we will. All right, let me just start off. I'll just touch on a few of the issues in no particular order. The Climate Change Act that has been passed. It's been something that's been on the table for about 15 years now, with a policy document, white paper, green paper, and all the other papers. And eventually, in the last 2 years, I sit on that committee. Through a lot of public consultation, I must say. There was a lot of public consultation over the bill. But the problem with the Climate Change Act is this, and it's a fundamental question that I asked when I spoke in the debate, because we support the Climate Change Act, the bill at that time. But the fundamental question is the financial implications of implementing legislation that we've passed. And the Minister of Environment was not able to inform us, and we even invited Treasury to tell us whether they will have the finances to make sure that whatever we've got there, the roles that we're passing on to local government, the roles we're passing on to provincial government, will they be able to meet those particular functions? And lo and behold, after the act was passed, signed by the president a few weeks ago, Deputy Finance Minister David Masondo, speaking on environmental issues, said, we don't have the money. We don't have the money because there are competing priorities in the country, and one can understand that, right? So why have lovely legislation that we cannot implement? But it's something that we need to go back to and look at it and see how much we can implement. On the question of coalition governments, whether it's coalition governments or not, but I think, 30 years into our democracy, and I've been part of this democracy actively for 30 years, right? Political parties need to find in themselves, particularly the leaders, the maturity to sit around a table and agree on the things that will take South Africa forward. The whole issue of the environment, the whole issue of providing housing, good health care, etc. I mean, these are sine qua nons. It'll be have to things that we all agree on. We won't agree with expropriation of land without compensation, right? The EFF will have another position in it. But even in a coalition arrangement, parties need to figure out what is it that we agree with and let's implement. And then you take the other issues and see how you can find each other over time. You're not going to agree on everything. But I think coalitions will work, government will work if we have that political maturity, which unfortunately, I must say, we don't have at this moment in time. But hopefully now, with the way election results are going and certain parties finding themselves in trouble, there will be a need to come together for us to talk and get there. I'm not pointing at anybody. The issue of political will, and that speaks to political will. We will find ourselves, and I think we will be able to do that. The last issue I want to talk about is, sometimes we forget with Eskom and the way they are trying to, it's not only the generation plants that are a problem, Kusile and all that, not problem, I mean, they cost us 4 or 5 times more, but it's the transmission of electricity. We do not spend money on maintenance in this country at local, provincial, or national government. Our water systems are crumbling because of poor maintenance of the systems that we had. Same with electricity. And what we need to do, and I said this to the president a few weeks ago when I had a question to him, we need to ring fence in every department an amount for maintenance, let alone capital projects, because we want to focus on this capital project. No, maintenance so we can maintain some of that infrastructure, whether it's water, electricity, hospitals, government buildings for the future, and get small and medium enterprises involved in that maintenance section. Let them do the maintenance of this thing. Lastly, I think there's certainly need for more dialogue like this, because it seems to me that the private sector and the public sector, prior to 1994, we had marches, we had all sorts of things imploring upon the government to change the policies. We don't have that civil society engagement and action like we had then. And I think that's something that we need, Ambassador, back in South Africa. So civil society, like the organizations here, need to put the pressure on government and the politicians that they elect. But on the 29th of May, you'll be able to choose who you want, and who you choose or who you don't choose will be what you get after the 29th of May. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Singh. Colleagues, I'm going to have to betray you. I can't take another set. We've fallen too far behind. I'm going to have to dissolve my panel. Can you please give a round of applause to them? Thank you. And another one for yourselves, please. That was amazing. Thank you so much.